Welcome back to another episode of Family History Fridays with the Butler Area Public Library. This week we are going to learn all about the secrets hidden in the data of federal census records. Now, the census has been collected every 10 years since 1790, and they are available after 72 years to look at those images, so we can look at every census from 1790 through 1940. So there's a lot of great information there for genealogy researchers. Now, I'm sure we all know some of the census basics. For example, we don't get everyone's name on the page until 1850, things like that. But I bet there's some information that you didn't know. For example, there's several census years that ask information about veterans. There are questions about mortgages and rent and unemployment and salaries. There's even clues to how many children a person has had, how many marriages they've had, education, and occupation. And I'll bet you didn't know that occupation is listed as early as the 1820 census. So I hope I have your interest, and let's get started.
Having copies of census forms is going to be really beneficial for you when you are digging into these federal census records. Often either the heading print is very small and muddy and a little hard to read, or in the case of the very early census years, may not be pre-printed on the forms at all. So to help you match up the information that's input on these charts, it's helpful to look at some transcribed census forms. You can find those on both Heritage Quest and Ancestry Library Edition, which you have access to as a Butler County Library Card holder. On Ancestry, if you click Charts and Forms here at the top of the page and then click Census Forms, you will find links to download versions of all of the U.S. Federal Census sheets. And you can see that they have a nice table where you can copy your own information down on there, but most importantly, nice clear transcriptions of all of the questions being asked. Those are also available on Heritage Quest. When you're on that homepage, you'll just click Research Aids at the top and then scroll down to Census Forms under the Getting Started box, and you'll get a PDF with all of them together. They're also freely available without a library card or any kind of subscription through the National Archives. If you go to archives.gov/research/genealogy, there are charts and forms available for you. And again, there are individual PDFs of all of the census questions that you can easily use to read these documents. 1790 is the first federal census that was taken, and it is also the most simplistic. You'll see that there are just 3 columns of information for the people in the household divided by age, and here we have 2 columns for males, one for those age over 16, the second for those age under 16. So, for example, here in the household of Robert Little, we have 3 males over the age of 16 and 6 under. And then a third column for all females regardless of age. So there are 3 women or girls in this household. The last 2 columns indicate all other free persons not enumerated in these first 3, and then a column for slaves. You can see that there's 1 indicated down here. Now, the 1800 and 1810 census years are going to follow a similar formula, but they break down the ages into smaller categories. So you can see here in 1800, we have a number of columns for age, similarly in 1810. But you'll notice the problem that we have here is that none of these pages are standardized forms, so we don't have any headings to help us out, and this is where referring back to those pre-printed census pages will really help you. So here we see the 1810 census, and you can see that the head of the family starts it off, and then we enumerate free white males and free white females in certain age groups. So typically it goes under 10, 10 through 15, 16 to 25, 26 to 44, and then 45 and over, and then the same for females. And then again, the final two columns will be other free persons and enslaved persons. So if we come back here and look at those 1800 and 1810 census records, you can see this sort of double line here helps demarcate the difference between the males in the household and the females, and that will help you match up those ages for each of these households. Similarly, in 1810, the same thing. They've put a double line to help differentiate between the males and the females being enumerated. Now, the 1820 census may look very similar to the census years that preceded it, but there's actually a lot more information being collected here. 1820 is significant for a few reasons. First, it is the first to ask questions regarding naturalization and occupation, and it is also the first year where we differentiate for enslaved people between males and females and break them down by age, and also differentiate between enslaved persons and free people of color. Now, it's a little hard to see looking at this chart, so I'm going to flip over to the transcribed version. So here we can see the breakdown between white males and white females, and then here towards the end we have a breakdown between male and female enslaved persons and male and female free people of color. Now, this is going to be really significant if you are doing African American research and working your way back. In the center here are 4 columns that are significant. The first one deals with naturalization and citizenship status, so you see foreigners not naturalized. And then the other 3 have to do with occupation. So they ask for the number of persons in the household engaged in agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing. So this is going to help you differentiate between those people who are engaged in farming, they might run a business, they might be involved in manufacturing of some kind. So if we come back to the 1820 census I have up here from Harmony here in Butler County, it's a little difficult. You'll need to count the columns because there are no pre-printed headings in use here. But the 12th column is the one that starts your persons not naturalized. So here you can see we have 2 households on this page that have persons who are of foreign birth who are not naturalized. And then the following columns indicate the people who are involved in agriculture, in commerce, and in manufacturing. So this community right here that we're seeing on this page, a lot of manufacturing work. If we flip over to this image, which is in Maryland, you can see that this community had pre-printed census headings, and it's a little easier to see. There still is no standardized sheet that folks are using, so it's going to be different in every location. But we can see again here, if we zoom in, here is the column for foreigners not naturalized, and if we scroll down, there are none on this sheet. But we do see a number of persons involved in agriculture. That indicates to me that this is a farming community that's being enumerated. And then we have the columns for commerce and manufacturing. So this is going to give you an idea of your ancestor, what field they're engaged in, what work they're doing, and it's also going to be helpful if you have folks with similar names in the same community. It might help you differentiate between the 2 and determine which household is actually the correct ancestor for your research. The 1830 census is significant because it's the first year that we finally have a standard printed form for all locations around the United States. So you'll see here, not only do we have printed headings here in Butler County, Pennsylvania, but they look exactly the same as the printed headings for Cape May, New Jersey. So it's going to make it a lot easier on you if you have folks who are moving about the country because the forms are going to look exactly the same. The other thing that's significant is that starting in 1830, we have 2 census years where the record actually extends onto a second page. So you can see here at the top, we have the enumeration by age, and there are more divisions in terms of the age ranges that they're looking at for white males and white females, but we actually need to use our little arrow button here on the right and turn the page to the second half of the sheet. So we have data for enslaved persons and free people of color. And then if we zoom in and take a look, there are some additional questions being asked in 1830 regarding health. So we do not have the occupation question in this census, but we do have some questions relating to health and citizenship. So if we look at our transcribed census record here, we can see that they are going to be asking about folks who are deaf, dumb, or blind. And then again, still asking about people of foreign birth who are not yet naturalized. So if we look here, and again, we can see that this is some pretty muddy print for the questions related to health and disability. So it's good to have that transcribed sheet to refer back to, but it's your health questions first, and then that question regarding citizenship. And if we scroll down, we can see we do have one person of foreign birth who is not yet naturalized here, and a few more down here at the bottom of the page, and then they're just doing your totals at the bottom. The 1840 census is another one with 2 pages. It's the last time you're going to need to turn the page to make sure you're catching all your data when doing federal census research. You can see here again on the first page, we are looking at a breakdown of people in the household by gender and by age. And then if we turn the page to the right, we have our additional questions. Now, the columns regarding employment have come back this year. If we zoom in on those, you can see that there's more. If I'm going to switch to our transcribed version to make this a little easier. But we are not just asking about farming and commerce. We are asking if there are folks involved in mining, navigation of the ocean, navigation of canals, lakes, and rivers, and learned professional engineers. So we are breaking down into more specific types of employment here. And then this next column is really exciting because it has to do both with military, and it's the first glimpse that we're going to get of the names of other people in a household. For the first time, we're getting the name of somebody other than the head of house. So in this column on the second page, they are asking for information of pensioners for Revolutionary War service. And you're going to get not just the name, but the specific age of the person who is a Revolutionary War veteran getting a pension from the federal government. So in this instance, we have William Harvey, who is 70 years old. He lives here in Muddy Creek Township, Butler, in 1840. And what's interesting with this specific example is if we flip back to the previous page, we can see he's in the third household. William Harvey is not actually the head of household. He's living in the household of George King. You can see here that there are 2 adult males in this house, one between the age of 50 and 60, and one between 60 and 70. So we know that William Harvey is 70 years old. This has to be him, which means George King here is in his 50s. And so there's presumably maybe some kind of family relationship here between King and William Harvey. So that's an avenue of future research for you to investigate. The 1850 census is so important and significant for genealogy researchers because we finally get every person in the household identified by name and by their specific age. So it's going to become so much easier to keep track of people census year to census year now that we have those ages and names identified. So you will see here that we have everyone in a household identified. We have their ages, their sex, and their race. We also get their occupation or trade, and we get a money question. The value of their real estate is indicated here, which can be really interesting if you are trying to track down a piece of property. You can see that these folks, their real estate is valued at about $450 or $350 in 1850 money. But down here, we actually have somebody whose property is worth $1,200. So we have some varying sizes of property listed here. We have a distiller with $1,000. They are also now going to ask specific birthplaces for everyone. So this is important when we are trying to track down where people are born. We're not just going to have a check mark if they are foreign and not yet naturalized. We know where everyone is born. So specific states, you can see all of these folks here with the ditto marks are born in Pennsylvania. But we have someone born in Germany, and another person down here towards the bottom of the page born in France. So we get specific nations that people have originated from. Now we need to be careful because 1850, we have names, but we still don't know specific relationships. We can infer in the households that, so for example, Samuel Miller and Ann Miller here are probably married to one another. They're in their early 30s, and then we have a number of minor children, but we can never entirely know the relationship of all of these people for a fact. We have to infer and then use some other research to back it up. One relationship question that we do have, though, is this column. Let's pull back up to the top. They ask if you were married within the last year. So that is the only time we're going to be able to really hone in on marital status, is if they are newlyweds. We also have some other personal questions here. We ask if the people attended school within the year. So we're going to get hash marks here for most of the children that appear, but obviously the infants here, we have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. They're not going to school yet, but it also might help you find out when somebody leaves school to take up an occupation or to work the family farm, things like that. We also have another column here in column 12. We are looking for adults over the age of 20 who cannot read and write. So we're getting a feel through this data of who is illiterate. So here we have a couple of adults who cannot read or write. And then our final column is asking about diseases and social status and disability again. So we're looking for folks who are deaf, who are blind, who are paupers, who are convicts, or who are deemed insane. 1860 asks the exact same questions as the 1850 census with one slight variation. In the 1860 year, they subdivide the value of the estate into real estate and personal estate. When you're looking at this, real estate is going to refer to their property, so the land that they own. Whereas the personal estate are all of their personal belongings. So in this instance, Mr. Shepherd here, who is a hatter, his real estate, his land is worth $2,500. His personal estate, all of his personal effects, $500 value. The 1870 census is going to look very familiar because it's following the format set up in the 1850 and 1860 census years. There's 2 additions that are worth pointing out. The first has to do with the parents of each person on the page. So we know that we've started asking where each individual listed on the page is born. In 1870, we're also going to ask if the father or mother of each of these persons was born overseas. They're not asking specifically where, just if they were. So if we look down the page here, we can see that we have a few people who themselves were born in Ireland, so their parents were also born overseas. But then when we get to this person, Julian Dugan, we can see that he was born in Pennsylvania, but his parents, Margaret and Robert here, were born overseas. We might also find individuals, this 25-year-old Joshua Black was born in Pennsylvania, but indicates that both his father and mother were born overseas. So this helps you look at a further generation back and get a feel for where those folks were born, and it might help you narrow down your immigrant generation. The second thing that is added in the 1870 census has to do with voting rights. So just a few months before the 1870 census was recorded, the 15th Amendment was passed, which guaranteed voting rights to all male citizens regardless of race. So we have two questions here. The first one in column 19 is just asking if the person is a male citizen of the United States over the age of 21, so eligible to vote. The second column is specifically asking if that person is over the age of 21 but has had their voting rights infringed upon. So they've been denied the right to vote either through violence, poll taxes, things like that. So you will get a feeling in this column if someone has had their constitutional rights violated. The 1880 census is so important because we finally get relationship information for all of these people that we're seeing listed here. So now we don't have to guess. We can actually see that someone is a wife, a son, a daughter to the head of the household. And we also can find some interesting relationships. For example, here in this house of Alicia Bard, we have a stepdaughter and two stepsons, so we know that there is a second marriage happening. In the neighboring house, we see someone listed as a servant, so we know that they are probably not a biological relation, they are an employee. We have someone listed here as a boarder. So all kinds of things that we can see. We even have someone listed here as an apprentice, so we can see that he is an apprentice harness maker living with Jacob Munty up here, who is a professional harness maker. So relationships are so important to figuring out exactly who these people are who are living in each of these houses. We also have specific marital status for the first time. So single, married, or widowed and divorced. We have 3 columns for those questions. There's one specific addition to your occupation column, and that is column 14 that asks how many months in the previous year the person was unemployed. So you might find a number there if somebody was having a difficult year and was out of work. The last addition in 1880 that's worth pointing out is here at the end of the page. This is the first time that we get specific birth locations for the person listed and both of their parents. So remember in 1870, they were asking if the parents were foreign born, just a yes or a no. Now we get specific answers. So we can see here that the first person listed on this page was born in Württemberg, and so were both of their parents. Further on down the page, we see someone who was born in Pennsylvania, but their parents were born in New Hampshire. We have folks with parents born in Ireland, in Ohio, all kinds of locations, domestic and international. Unfortunately, we do not have the 1890 census available to us in most instances. A 1921 fire at the U.S. Commerce Building destroyed about 25% of the 1890 census, and then a good amount of the pages that weren't destroyed by fire were severely damaged by smoke and water from the firefighters extinguishing that fire. Now, the census records themselves were not immediately disposed of. There were some discussions about attempting to transcribe this remaining data, but nothing was done for a number of years, and those records were eventually disposed of in the 1930s. So we unfortunately have a gap in time between the 1880 and 1900 census years where we do not have data for people. It is estimated that there's only about 6,000 names total for the entire United States that are surviving duplicate sheets from that 1890 census. The 1900 census carries on most of the questions that we've been seeing from the 19th century. We just have a few more additions. The first is that for city dwellers, this is the first time that we get an actual street address. So if you look on the far left side of your page for folks who were living in cities, you will get the name of the street written up the side. So these first few households on this page live on North McCain Street in Butler, Pennsylvania. And then the next column, the number that you see, is their house number. So for example, this family lives at 128 North McCain Street. The next thing that is significant are some additional personal details. So not only are they asking the age of each person, but they're actually asking for the specific month and year that they were born. This was done to try and cut down on any confusion with the ages. Since the census is usually collected in the middle of the year, sometimes people's birthday falls before or after it. So they were asking more specific questions in two ways to get an accurate count of people's ages. The other column that is worth note is column 10. They ask the number of years that the person was married. So you can finally do a little math and get a feel for the marriage year of the people on these pages. So we can see here this first person who's carried over from the previous page. She has been married for 49 years. This couple listed directly below have been married for 40 years. So we can estimate that they were probably married in 1860. The other personal description that is added, they asked just of adult women. And this is in columns 11 and 12. They asked these women how many children they had given birth to, and then how many of those children were still living. So you can see that for both of these women at the top of the page, they had experienced some loss in the family. So Amanda Pattison here, 4 children born, but only 2 still living. For this person further down the page, she had given birth to 7 children, but only 4 are still living. So this might help you track down some missing family members who died of childhood illness that you were previously not familiar with. We are still asking questions about parents' birthplaces, so that will be familiar for you. But we get some specific questions coming back about citizenship. So they ask 3 questions for you here. They ask the year of immigration, so we can see that this person immigrated in 1854. Next, they ask how many years you've been in the United States. They say 45. And then the third column, you get a little abbreviated code for naturalization status. And now this can sometimes throw people off. You're going to see 3 possible answers here if the person is an immigrant. The first is AL, which means alien, so they are of foreign birth and have not started the naturalization process. You might see PA, that stands for first papers, so they've declared their intention to become a citizen, but they aren't yet finished with the process. That can be especially confusing for folks who live here in Pennsylvania, because often we might think that that PA stands for Pennsylvania, naturalized in Pennsylvania, but that is not the case. And the third code that you'll see, like this one here, is NA. That stands for naturalized. Make sure you're not mistaking that for NA as in not applicable. NA in this case means a naturalized citizen of the United States. And the last addition that we want to point out here is at the very end right-hand side of the columns. This has to do with the ownership of the home. So they are going to ask for letters to be filled in here. In the first column, you will get an O if the home is owned, or an R if it's rented. The next column, if it is owned, there will be an F for owned free, meaning they own the home outright, or an M if they still have a mortgage. And then in the third column, they're going to ask if it's a farm or a house. So we can see here it's an H because it's a house. For the more rural locations, you'll probably see Fs for farms. The 1910 census is nearly identical to its predecessor, so you're going to see the same information about addresses, about the number of children that have been born, about parents' nativity, and about citizenship status. A few things that are of note: there's a slight change to the question about marriage. Now they still ask the number of years of your current marriage, so we can see here's a couple who've been married for 32 years and one who have been married for 4, but they do indicate in this 1910 census year if this is their first marriage, second marriage, things like that. So M1 indicates first marriage. And as you can see, most of the folks here are on their first marriage, but down here we do have a person who is on marriage number 3, his wife on marriage number 2. So we do get some clues here to look for previous spouses and proof of either the death of a spouse or divorce. The other additional information on the 1910 census is going to come into play with occupation. So we're still asking what they do, but we're getting a second column that asks about the industry. So for example, we have not just that they're a farm laborer, but that it's a home farm rather than a large farming operation. We have a mail carrier in a rural route as opposed to a city route. We have a doctor who is doing country practice. And then these other columns have codes for the type of employment. So if they are an employer, an employee, or working on their own account. So OA here for this doctor means he works on his own account, he's self-employed. W just means a worker. And then the last 2 columns in the occupation section have to do with unemployment. So they ask in column 21 if you were out of work on a specific date, April 13th, 1910. And then the other question that they ask is the number of weeks of the entire 1909 calendar year that you were unemployed. So we can see here we have zeros for these folks. Nobody was out of work in the previous year. But once we get down to this person whose occupation is just a laborer doing odd jobs, he had 4 weeks in the previous year where he was out of work. Coming back up, we will still see the same questions about renting or owning the home. And the last question that I want to point out is this third to last column, column 30. This gives you clues to military service. They are specifically asking if you were a veteran of the Union or Confederate Army or Navy. So this has to do with Civil War veterans who are becoming aged and collecting pensions. And if we scroll down here, we do see a couple of instances with UA filled in that indicates Union Army. You might also see CA for Confederate Army or UNCN if they were in the Union or Confederate Navy. Don't worry about some of these additional notations, the numbers and the X's and the checks that you see. Those were added after the census was done when they were doing data analysis. So these are sort of in-house numbers for the Census Bureau and not specifically numbers provided by your ancestors on the page here. There's not much that changes in the 1920 census. The most significant things are just rearranged. So here we can see that our questions regarding owning or renting have just been moved to the column in between the relationships and the personal data for people. One thing that has been added is an additional column next to the lines for people and their parents regarding mother tongue. So we can see here we have a lot of folks born in Pennsylvania, but if we scroll down until we have someone whose parents were foreign born, we have someone whose parents were born in Germany and whose predominant language was German. Here we can see someone whose parent was born in England, but their language is English. This language question is significant for anyone doing research on immigrants because it might help you narrow down geographically where they came from within much larger geographic areas which were in flux at this time because we are facing a lot of geopolitical uprising and wars in the early 20th century. For example, if we look at the center of this page, we see a lot of people born in Austria, referring most likely to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But we see different languages being spoken. So in this couple, for example, this person speaks German and is from Austria, but this person speaks Magyar or Hungarian. The same thing is happening here. We see a lot of instances of the Hungarian language versus the German language. This is going to help you narrow down where each of these individuals came from in Austria-Hungary. So are they from a Germanic-speaking area, or are they from the area that today would be considered Hungary? There are just a few slight adjustments to the 1930 census that I'm going to point out. The first is an additional question regarding home ownership or renting. In 1930, they add a column in which they are asking if you're a homeowner, what the value is of your home. So you can see here that this person owns and their house is worth $4,500. Their neighbor also owns. The home is valued at $2,000. Further down the page, we have a renter. His rent is $15, presumably per month. There's a slight change to the marriage question under personal description. In previous years, they had been asking how many years you were married. In 1930, they ask your age at first marriage. So the number that you're seeing here in column 15 is how old each person was when they were first married. Now, that's usually going to be something that matches up. So here, for example, we have a couple who are currently 62 and 50 respectively. When they were married, they were 28 and 16. But you might find some numbers where the math isn't quite matching, and that might indicate a second marriage has taken place. So you'll want to analyze those numbers. The last thing that I'm going to point out in the 1930 question is an added question for veterans. So here on the right, they ask if you are a veteran of the United States military or Navy. So it's a yes or no question. And then they ask which war or expedition it is. So you'll see a number of letter codes here in this column. So WW means World War. So we would know that as the First World War, but for them it's just the World War. Further on down, an SA indicates Spanish American. You might also see some other numbers. Here's another Spanish American War veteran. You might see CW, meaning that they are Civil War veteran, as there are still some veterans of that war living in the 1930s. And you might see some other indications like the Philippine War, the Mexican War, or even the Boxer Rebellion. So this is a good clue to military service for the men that you are researching. And finally, we come to the last census images that are available, the 1940 census. 1940 is going to start changing it up a little bit, both the questions that are asked and who's being asked those questions. But in terms of universal questions, most of the identifying info is going to stay the same in terms of names, addresses, ages. One thing that is added in the education column is here in column 14, they ask the last grade of school completed. So you're going to see a lot of different answers here. This is a 9-year-old boy, so his answer is just 3rd grade. But with some of the adults, we have someone with a 6th grade education, an 8th grade education. Anything with an H and then a number after it indicates years of high school. So this looks like H2. Or if it's a C, for example, C1, this person has completed 1 year of college. So that's what those number and letter codes mean in column 14. It's their highest level of education. In the center of the page, they ask an interesting residency question. They actually ask you where you were living in April of 1935. So for a lot of people, you might see same house or same place filled in. They haven't moved in the last 5 years. But you actually may have some folks who have moved. So this specific census page that we're looking at is in Forward Township, Butler County. But we have some folks here. This family was living in a rural area of Butler County, different from Forward. These 3 individuals lived in Pittsburgh, but have moved up to Butler County within the last 3 years. And we have a couple other people who had lived in Evans City, so elsewhere in the county. So you'll get an idea of people moving. You also have a few additional questions related to occupation being asked towards the end of your column. So there is a code of worker question here that's being asked where you're going to get a couple of number codes. So OA, again, meaning own account, they're employed. PW meaning private work. They're someone's employee, but you also might get an E, which means they're an employer, possibly a business owner, or a GW, meaning that they're involved in government work. You're also going to have a question towards the end about income. Column 32 asks what your income was the previous year, 1939. So we see someone who made $600 in 1939, someone who made, it looks like, $1,800. So you're going to get an idea of what their salary was, how much money they had to support their family. And then we are still, of course, asking the number of weeks that you were employed. We are coming out of the Great Depression still, and so we are looking at unemployment numbers and if people are working in private industry versus public service work, government work, things like that. Now, one thing to note is that starting in 1940, we are not asking as many questions about everyone's extended family. When you look down at the bottom, they're only asking 2 people per page where their parents were born. So here you just get the answers for 2 individuals from lines 14 and 29, where their parents were born, their personal mother tongue, veteran status, and if they've applied for Social Security. So unfortunately, these questions, they're very interesting, but we're not going to get that data for everyone on the page. We're only going to get them for a select number of persons, 2 per page.
So now that we've seen how each census differs and what information is hidden within all of those records, I hope this has inspired you to revisit your research, look at those census records and see what interesting facts you might be overlooking, what clues there are to help you broaden your genealogical research. And as always, you can reach out to us if you have any questions. Happy researching.